Okay, so we are continuing our discussion of science and religion, and we'll see if this is working. I presume you can see it in a reasonable way to look at it. Yes? Okay,
Good
great.
font. Good.
Okay, good, good. Um, so yeah, that's right. It was Wednesday when we were reading an article. I was having problems. Well, anyway, so we're back into this into the discussion of science and religion. And as I keep coming back to this idea, the way I look at this subject is through the eyes of two leaps of faith. Leap of faith number one is there a God? And by God, for this discussion, I mean a intelligence behind the creation of the universe. And I guess to be more specific, I would say an intelligence which created a universe that is anthropomorphic. Really good word. It means a
Mhm.
universe that can sustain life. And then, last time we also looked at all of the sort of amazing coincidences that put us in what my friend Bob Piccioni calls the Goldilocks zone we're in a great galaxy. We're in a good spot in the galaxy. We have a terrific sun. We're in a good spot in the solar system. We have some oddities of the circular orbit of Earth and the nature of water. And I've actually been getting a bunch of comments from people who have watched the video on YouTube, and it's been kind of fun corresponding with them on the subject. So 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 that is a God that I would say creates, the laws of physics. And and in one tradition, there's a Jewish tradition called which refers to this aspect of God as Elohim. And the word Elohim also means judges. And but then the next question, which we're really going to focus on tonight, is the question of does God care? And there's a Jewish tradition that the caring God, the compassionate God, is often associated with the Yud He Vav He, the four-letter tetragrammaton, the unpronounceable name of God, which when we come to it, we say the word Adonai, which means my Lord. So so the focus of tonight is on the question, does God care? And then of course that leads to the question, what do you mean does God care? And so again, I've talked about this a lot. Does God care whether I'm a nice person or a rotten person? Does God care whether I protect children or torture children? Does God care whether I observe the Sabbath or not? Does God care whether I have chicken or pork for dinner tonight? And we're coming up on Passover for those who view this video at some time in the future. Does God care, whether I keep kosher for Passover? Does God, and I'm going to give you some rules that I think most of us will be grateful that we are Reformed Jews. I was on a conference call today with priests and rabbis, and Elliot Dorff, who is the preeminent legal scholar in the conservative movement, pointed out. I'm not even sure I can explain why, but of course, the first Seder is Saturday night, right? So you can't do anything on Saturday directly to prepare for the Seder. So that brings you back to Friday. But on Friday, and I'm actually not sure. I really don't understand the reason for this, but you know about the Bedikat chametz, the searching for the chametz in your house. Okay. Apparently you have to do this on Thursday. So it's too late to do it on Friday. So you have to do it on Thursday. Okay. So what that means is you have to get rid of all the chametz in your house on Thursday. Okay. So if you have gotten rid of all the chametz in your house on Thursday, what do you do for challah Friday night? You would think, well, it's not Passover yet. I can have a challah, right? You would think that. I would think that, but we'd both be wrong. The answer is you must have egg matzah. I've never heard this before. Regular matzah is lechem oni. It's the bread of affliction, and the bread of affliction is not appropriate for a Erev Shabbat dinner, a Friday night dinner. So
Mhm.
you should have egg matzah, which is, rich and tastier. I can attest to this. I love egg matzah. But
Mhm.
egg matzah doesn't fulfill the obligation to eat matzah at a Passover Seder. Okay? So I'll explain
Mhm.
a little more. This is
Mhm.
all under the general category. Does God care whether I worry about these things or not? So it eating matzah. So there's two rules about Passover and matzah. One is you're not supposed to have any chametz, right? Everybody, I think we all know this.
Mhm.
Um, so matzah is fine, and egg matzah is not chametz. So egg matzah is fine
Mhm.
for just chomping down on any time during Passover, except at the Seder. Because at the Seder, it is a mitzvah, which is to say a commandment to eat matzah. Therefore, the matzah has to be a particular type, which means the bread of affliction, which egg matzah does not satisfy.
Right.
So the question is, does God care whether I protect children or torture them? Does God care whether I do my search for chametz on Thursday rather than another day this year? By the way, the laws of physics don't care about either of these things. The laws of physics don't care whether we're nice to children or torture them, and they certainly don't care when we eat what kind of matzah. By the way, on Saturday night, you don't have a full Havdalah, you only have the Havdalah candle. You don't have the spices. And don't ask me why, I really don't know. Alan.
Mhm.
I had some comments about why God cares, but before I get to that, I'm missing the point about the egg matzahs not being the same kind of matzah for purposes of in lieu of a challah on this particular. I understand the timing that is affected by when the Seder begins, but I don't understand the egg matzah part.
So um, matzah at a Passover Seder is lechem oni, the bread of affliction. You've heard this phrase, the bread of affliction.
Mhm.
So to be the bread of affliction, it has to be very plain and simple.
Mhm.
So in order to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah, because before we eat the matzah, we say two blessings. One is just the motzi, and the other one is the mitzvah blessing, Asher kitchanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al achilat matzah, who commands us, gives us commandments to be holy, and commands us to eat matzah. So the matzah we eat during a seder has to be regular matzah, not egg matzah. And if you look at your box of egg matzah carefully, it will say kosher for Passover, but it probably won't say, I'm going to mute Jay. But it'll say something like not to be used as Seder except for the old and infirm.
Is
Um,
this and this is an
Mhm.
Orthodox traditional.
well, it was Elliot Dorff saying it, so he's a conservative legal authority.
Yeah,
So my
no,
guess is,
I realize we could make
yeah,
some flexibility, but the concept is that you've cleaned out your house of all leavening, but you still want to say the motzi on Friday night when there's no leavening in the house, and so a regular matzah is not allowed because you haven't.
apparently regular matzah doesn't fulfill the spirit of Shabbat. I think that's what Elliot was saying.
Really, even but during in the little later next week, that's what we eat with matzah for Shabbat in the middle, or let's say when Passover is not over yet. I
Uh,
I'm
Probably Elliot would probably say no, but I'm guessing.
Yeah, it's okay. It's all right.
But
Can I?
my larger point is
Yeah.
leap number one, is there an organizing intelligence in the universe? I find the evidence from physics, that's what we've talked about the last two times, from cosmology and biology, to be compelling for me. Evidence for the existence of God. And then leap number two, does God care? And it gets pretty detailed. So for us Jews, I raise these questions of matzah and so on. For a Catholic, going to mass regularly. For other religions, caring. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Alan, your hand is still up, but I presume
Well,
that's.
I still have this
Oh,
question.
oh, go ahead.
I
Yes.
wanted to, before we got on the matzah, I would rephrase the care or elaborate does God care in the following way. The way I understand, or I want to understand, I don't know anything, but the way I'm
Mhm.
looking at it is that God created a world where God wanted a society to behave a certain way. And so all the orientation for our behavior is guided so that we would behave in a good way and do good things. And
Yes.
built into that, though, is this idea of free will and learning from mistakes. And so God doesn't care, except that we are supposed to understand and care in the way that I think you made your list. But God
What you
created,
said in your first sentence, you said something about God wanting to do something.
oh, God wanted to create a world.
Okay. Once you say God wanted,
Yeah.
then God cares about something. As
Yes.
distinguished between God as the laws of physics.
Okay.
You
But
know, the gravitation. Go ahead.
yeah, the specifics of caring, I was trying to modify, if not replace, with the idea that it's the things that we should and shouldn't do are the intention of what I understand God had in mind when they created the world and the Torah and all the
Right.
rules.
Right. So presumably, when you say God had in mind, where do you get this information about what God has in mind? Just out of curiosity.
So as I work my way through Genesis and
Stop. Okay.
Mhm.
Revelation. That was the
Mhm.
point I was after.
okay,
Okay. We don't need Bible, we don't need Revelation to examine cosmology and to have ask questions about, the speed of expansion after the Big Bang, the values of all these constants. I don't have to open my Bible to discuss that material. Okay. Which is why every now and again, I know Erwin disappeared again. I think he must be having a problem. Erwin would try and sneak in a midrash or sneak in a biblical quote, and I would, timeout penalty, 5 yards. So I didn't need any of that. But now, once I'm now in a discussion, and I appreciate your introduction of this discussion about whether God has any intentions here. And of course, if God has intentions, I think I have this. Yeah, okay. So if God cares, then that leads us to Revelation. That's exactly the point. So because if God cares, it follows for me logically that God would communicate that caring. If God didn't care what we did or anything about the universe, if God, is really the unmoved mover, if God's just the laws of physics, um, well, then there's no need for revelation. But once God has a stake in things, God has to communicate that stake. For me, that's just logic.
is this like parenting? You
Well, it's
deprive.
not only like parents parenting. I mean, it's sort of would be the extreme of a parent just never communicating with a child about anything about how that child conducts.
But we deprive, well, a parental tactic, if I can use that parallel for what we're talking
Mhm.
about. We deprive children from things so they can learn how to defer behavior. This idea that you can have the cookie, but you don't have the cookie the minute you want the cookie. If you learn how to
Right.
deprive a child to behave, to defer, deprive, and behave. I mean that's what this is feeling like. That God does want us to behave a
So
certain way.
there's free will, which is an important element
Oh,
here.
very much.
So God cares, but God is not controlling our behavior in the same way, presumably, that God controls the laws of
Okay.
gravitation and nuclear forces. So for me, it follows logically that if God cares, we have to accept the idea of revelation. And then that raises the question, must I take revelation literally, or can I take it seriously, but not literally? And of course, those of you that know me know that that's exactly the way I take it. So for Jews, the most significant question in this regard is what happened at Mount Sinai. And usually when I introduce this slide, I say, we know what happened at Mount Sinai. Charlton Heston, I mean, Moses climbed to the mountain and got tablets of the law. This always reminds me, I have, of course, the Plout Torah, about Chumash, and I should have done this to get Charlton Heston to sign my copy of the Torah. I think that would have been a brilliant idea, and I never thought of it till it was too late. Anyway, so the central question for Jews is what happened at Mount Sinai? And my answer is something happened, but what we have, our written Torah, is an imperfect record of what actually happened because it's communicated by people. And some of you have heard me talk about this before. So you've probably heard me talk about this before. Anyway, what are we looking at now?
Box.
Okay, we got a box. Any other thoughts? Henry, you're muted. I don't know if you want to.
We got box on it. We got little dots that make up the little shading here, and depending on the spacing of the dots, you get different density of the or what appears to be dots and so on this piece of paper or this page.
Okay. Any other thoughts? So what we have is, depending on where I'm showing this, it's either projected light and shadow on a screen, carbon dots on a page, if it's a handout, or for this purposes, it's a series of lit LEDs of varying intensity on your screens. Okay? Henry, you're interpreting as dots, not a bad interpretation, but people will describe it as a box or a cube, but really it is actually none of those. These are the things that it is. I know we have a psychologist with us, but at least no one's ever objected when I've shown this slide in the past. Psychologists tell us 90% of what we see is conditioned by our culture and expectations. And I would argue this affects what got written down at Sinai. Paul.
Yes, I'm going to turn everything on its head. What I mean by that is maybe God wanted things to be the way they are before he even created the universe. Maybe he thought about what's going to be, what's the earth going to look like after I create it, and what the people will be like after I create it. So I'm going to create this for them. They are going to have what I think is a great life, a nice life, because they are going to be my children. And then then he created the universe.
Okay, so when you have children, Paul, do you ever communicate with them what you would like them, and what would you not like them to do?
Yeah.
So that's the same idea here. The idea here is creation. I mean, the creation of a child is an act of insemination, whether it's lovemaking, whether it's artificial insemination, whether it's in vitro fertilization. That's the biology of creation. And then the caring about your children has to do with communication. And that's really what I'm talking about here. And so the question is, what communication occurred at Sinai?
Yes, but the children were thought about by two parents, a man and a woman, for pretty much, and they wanted a child. Then they're going to raise the child.
Yes.
It's not that they had a child and they better learn how to raise it. They want to know how to do it first, and then they have.
So I don't disagree with you. So it could have been in the mind of God before the universe was created.
That's right.
I mean, I would argue, the way I think about this is that God decided to create a universe that is hospitable to human life. And God wanted to make, and this is sort of a central element of Kabbalah, God wanted humans to be God's partner in making the world the kind of place that God wants it to be.
That's right. That's how I see it. Yeah.
Okay, but that takes communication. And the communication is revelation. Alan.
With the free will dimension at the foot of Sinai, when this information was communicated, created some people to agree with it, and some people didn't understand it, and some people didn't like it.
And some people do agree with it, and even though you agree with it, you may not be eating egg matzah on Friday nights, or you may actually not do your search for chametz. So you may agree in principle with it, but you may not be obeying every detail, and that's free will.
By the way, the matzah box from Manischewitz says the following in English as well in Hebrew: not a replacement for Seder matzah.
Okay, so is that egg matzahs?
Yeah, it's an egg matzah box.
Yeah. So that's exactly my point.
I never noticed that before.
I've done my job here. Any questions? And we'll see you next. No. Okay. So here's one of my favorite little illustrations. I do this just because it's fun. Some of you have seen this before. So not only is what we see influenced by our culture and society, but also about our access to the electromagnetic spectrum. Our eyes can only see a very small fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum.
That's right.
Okay, the electromagnetic spectrum goes into gamma rays. These are very, very short wavelengths, X-rays, ultraviolet light, visible light, infrared, radar, FM, TV, shortwave, AM. I think technically gravitational waves aren't actually part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but also very long waves. So here's the question for you, and if you know the answer, if you've heard the answer from me, don't respond. But let's say this whole electromagnetic spectrum can be represented by the proverbial 3,000-mile distance between Los Angeles and New York, okay, or between me and Cheryl. And so there's a fraction, so that's the entire spectrum. There's a fraction that we can see. What would you guess that fraction would be as represented by a distance?
Whoa.
I don't.
Whoa is not, you have to give me the units for that, Paul. You can use feet, inches, miles, furlongs, whatever makes most. What would you just guess? Just guess. This is guessing time.
Infinite.
No, it can't be infinite
I'll
because
guess a meter.
you guess a meter. The total's 3,000 miles. We can only see a small fraction.
I'd say
So
maybe
the
a
question
foot.
is,
Maybe
okay, so
maybe at 2 inches. 2 inches.
2 inches. We have 2 inches. We have a meter. Do we have any other bids?
But it goes on indefinitely in both directions of being
Oh
small.
no, I'm talking about from 10 to the minus 14th, probably meters to 10 to the 4th meters. Okay, that's the electromagnetic spectrum. Part of that is the visible light. I don't want to get into whether it's infinite now.
Okay.
Okay.
I know what you
So,
mean.
okay, so we had a meter, we had 2 inches. The answer is smaller than the diameter of a hydrogen atom.
No way.
So the amount, the fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum that our eyes can perceive compared to 3,000 miles is smaller than the smallest atom.
You're kidding.
So yeah, go ahead, Alan.
No, I was thinking you just put a few words in that made me respond differently. The creation of the function of the human eye and vision and brain is related to the spectrum that you're describing. And so the way, I'm going to say it in my English, the way God created our anatomy is a certain way, which
You're
is
getting way too theological and complicated for me.
all right.
You shall not be more confusing than the rabbi. That's one of the standing rules here.
I try.
Okay.
That's funny.
So my point is, not only was what we saw influenced by our culture, but we could only perceive a small fraction of what was really going on.
Right.
I often think about it. Suppose we could perceive a much larger part of the spectrum. In your homes right now, our FM radio is AM radio, our cell phone conversation, TV, and all kinds of noise and everything else. If we actually could perceive all of that, we would go nuts. So my point is, there's a lot going on. My point actually is, there was a lot going on at Sinai. Our record of that is the written Torah, but there's a lot of that that was influenced by our culture. And there's a lot of that we couldn't perceive. And, a feminist would say that a lot of it is influenced by the fact that men wrote it down. Why didn't the women write it down? Because they were holding the babies. So that also influences, what would the Torah look like if it had been written by women? I suspect different. So as you as you guess or know about me, is I take Torah very seriously, but I don't take it literally. I think of Torah, and Jay has heard me say this many times. I think of Torah as our central myth, but in the highest sense of myth. It's our central story that explains our culture and existence. I would say the Torah is true in the same way that the story of the boy who cried wolf is true. I will often, in given talks like this, ask the question, have you heard of the story of the boy that cried wolf? Doesn't it, not every culture has it. And then I ask, did it really happen? And most people will say, well, I don't know. Maybe, yes, who knows? And then I would say, suppose I could prove to you that story never happened, that it was, made up by Aesop or whoever. I don't think it's one of Aesop's fables, but it never really happened. Would that affect the truth of the story? Because the truth of the story is to teach a lesson.
Right.
And I would argue that is the truth of Torah. The truth of Torah is not, was there really a Garden of Eden, a man, a woman, and a talking serpent? I don't believe that for a minute, but the stories in Genesis teach lessons that I think are truer and deeper than what we see in science books. And last comment here is science and history books are quickly obsolete. I haven't kept a single book from my graduate school days in physics and optics and so on. They are quickly obsolete, but the Torah is still studied. Paul.
Yes. If I'm to think that God made the universe first and then made something afterwards, then would I be correct in saying that God wrote the whole Bible and he gave it to us rather than men write the Bible? I don't know who wrote the Bible. How do you know who wrote it first? Who was the instigator of writing things down?
So are you suggesting that the Torah scroll in the Ark was written by God at
Yes.
Temple Adat Elohim, or the calligrapher that we hired to write it?
No, it was written by God. He wrote the whole. That's what I learned.
I
from
saw the
Chabad.
calligrapher write it, Paul.
That's what I learned from Chabad. God,
No, I understand that you heard from
God-
Chabad.
yeah,
and that's
God,
why it
God
is
wrote the
this-
Bible, but I don't know if that's really right or not. I don't know.
So the question, right, that as I say, that's the central question
Yeah,
for Jews. What
Right.
happened at Sinai?
right, exactly.
And so I would say, the way I look at it, personally, I think I have this maybe even in the next slide. I look at it two ways, and they seem to be conflicting. On one hand, I study Torah as though it is the literal word of God. And therefore, every subtlety, every misspelling, every grammatical issue has infinitely deep meaning.
Right.
On the other hand, I also look at it through scholarly eyes. And I notice that that in the Garden of Eden, God is referred to one way, and outside the Garden of Eden, God is never referred to that way. And I notice that in Deuteronomy, there's a characteristic language of Deuteronomy. And there's all kinds of conflicts in the Torah. So, for example, a glaring conflict. Well, here's a glaring conflict. The opening of the Torah says, Genesis 1:26, God made humanity, male and female, he made them. Okay? That's in Genesis 1:26. Then in the middle of Genesis 2:4, all of a sudden we're in the Garden of Eden. There's no people, there's no animals, there's no plants, there's no nothing. And God makes the man first, and then the woman from some part of the man, presumably the rib. So which one is true? They're different stories. Which one of those is true? Paul?
I would not know. I would
And-
guess that God wrote it in there that way. He wrote it in there that way. The first way.
Right. I would say Chabad teaches that God wrote it in there.
Right. They
Right.
teach
Right.
that.
Right.
That way.
Another glaring conflict, if you study it carefully, in the stories of Noah's Ark. In one phrase, it says there was one pair of animals, male and female. And then in the next verse, it says there are 7 pairs of clean animals, kosher animals, and 1 pair of non-kosher animals. And, the scholars say they come from different sources. So what I would say, here's my answer to your question, but it's not Chabad's answer. And that's a very important thing for me to acknowledge.
Right. Right.
My answer is that something happened at Sinai. Humanity or the Israelites and God interacted. God communicated with the Israelites, and then peoples remembered those stories and remembered that and wrote it down. And so we had a huge collection of myths, of sacred stories that get written down, that are told orally, and then eventually people start writing them down. And even when there was a conflict between the two stories, the redactor, the person who put the Bible together, kept all the different stories. That's my Reform interpretation of what happened. You will never hear that from a Chabad rabbi.
No, you would not. No.
Which is why I am less stringent about the details of Jewish law than a Chabad rabbi.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Because if I believe it is literally God, then presumably I will obey the laws. On the other hand, most of the laws come after in the Talmud and so on. And that's a whole other story. But let me continue.
Can I say one thing? And
Sure.
I'm going off tangent for a second. When I was contemplating coming to a Reformed synagogue, somebody at Chabad told me that if you leave Chabad, you're not Jewish.
Oh,
If you go to a Reformed synagogue,
Paul,
you're not
stop.
God.
I don't dispute that someone from Chabad told you that,
Okay.
but it's demonstrably false. The only
Okay.
issue, whether you're Jewish or not, is whether your mother is Jewish.
That's
from
right.
Chabad's
That's
point of
how
view.
I see it.
They might have said Reform Judaism is not true Judaism. That's
Right.
something that I think you would reasonably hear from a Chabad source.
Right.
But
Right.
to say you're not Jewish is
Or you're not practicing Judaism if you go
that's
to another place like.
that's what I would expect to hear.
Yeah, that's what I.
Okay,
That's what
so-
I feel.
So as I was going through some of my sources to prepare for this class, there was a nice chart in Bob Piccioni's book, and I give him full credit here, comparing the book of Genesis with the Big Bang Theory. So in the book of Genesis, it says long ago, in the beginning, there was nothing. And that's exactly what the Big Bang Theory says. And then God created the universe in an instant, exactly what the Big Bang Theory says. God says, let there be light. And the first things that come are energy, space, and time, which is light. Then there's a heavenly firmament, almost envisioned as a bowl with stars and suns and moons and planets. And then, of course, what we're going to have as the Big Bang develops, we get stars and galaxies and planets. And then we get the book of Genesis, plants and animals. And I should have put this in here, but I'm sure I just copied what he had. You basically have, it's not part of the Big Bang Theory, but as life evolves on Earth, you have animals and then you have humans. And in the book of Genesis, this took 6 days. And in the Big Bang Theory, this took 13.8 billion years. Okay? So now one interesting question is, can they both be true?
Right.
Yes. Yes.
That it took 6 days and it took 13.8 billion years?
Yep.
How can they both be true? How do you
Well-
resolve that? I'm going to actually agree with you in the end, but I'm going to be sufficiently
Well,
confusing that.
It reminds me of that joke where we ask God, how long, it took to what's a million years in.
That's
in
actually
your-
from one of the Psalms. 1,000 years is but an instant in your sight.
Right. And then the person says, well, God, can I get some help from you? And God
Yeah.
says,
Wait a
minute."
second. Yes. Yes. So, but the Torah text says days,
Yeah.
and presumably a day means a day means a day. But that's one answer, that a day in God's sight is different. Ken and Patricia.
Well, that's just what I was going to say, is that we know that the Torah plays fast and loose with measurements. And so,
Where do you get the hold on? Give me an evidence of where the Torah is playing fast and loose.
Well, when it says that that 400 people, or there was 400 of something, and 400 is just an example of a big number. So it wasn't necessarily 400, it just was a lot. It just means a
Okay.
lot.
Okay. I would say that's what biblical scholars would say. I'm not sure that's what Chabad would say. I think Chabad would say 40 days and nights of rain, or really 40 days and nights of rain.
What about
That's a good point.
years?
Or 40, 40 years in the desert is 40 years in the desert. Moses is on Sinai for 40 days, and so on. Yeah, Henry.
I think this goes along with your thesis about you take it seriously and versus literally and
Right.
so on. And because, science tells us the information here on the right, and yet our tradition tells us the stuff on the left, and the one on the left is kind of a blended concept in terms of what is, ultimately they kind of blend together here. But when you want to know the actual factual, you'll look here on the right versus the left.
By the way, I would point out, I've never heard a Jew say this, but fundamentalist Christians will sometimes say, you look at the fossil record, or you look at carbon dating and other kinds of dating, which tells us how old the universe is, and those were tricks that God planted in the universe to test our faith.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that for a minute, Alan.
So in our Jewish tradition or teachings, is the definition of day actually defined as, say, from sunset to sunset, as I might define it that way?
So I have never. Well, I'm gonna. So the answer is yes. I've never heard a Jewish scholar argue that a day might have been what, 2 billion years.
Well, yeah. So we are working with. Well, I'm not going to say
unless there's a good reason to say something otherwise. Then, if it's called a day, we're going to call it a day.
Okay, and the year is the other question. That all these things, as we define it, that we define.
Put it this way: the people standing at Sinai knew what a day meant. They knew what 24 hours meant, that sunrise to sunrise.
They knew what 40 days of Moses being not coming down.
Right, yeah. Right. Okay, so now I'm going to go actually in a different, well, let me see where this is. Okay, so reading the Torah, actually, one of the problems I have, I need to fix this, but I'm not going to do it now. Reading the Torah, I think it says, what does it say?
Literally and figuratively.
Literally and figuratively. It's actually blocked by a thing on my computer. Okay. Jewish tradition teaches us to dig for deeper meanings. On at least 4 levels, I'm going to have a slide on this. The literal, simple, allegorical, interpretive, and secret. There's a tradition, it's called Pardes, and I'll show it to you in a second, that every bit of Torah has at least 4 levels of meaning. And there's another tradition which I really like, which would argue that there are at least 600,000 different understandings of every verse, going back to the 600,000 people who were at Sinai, and they may have heard slightly different things. But in terms of Pardes, the word Pardes means paradise. I think it comes from a Greek word. And it's a reminder, it's an acronym for the different levels of interpreting Torah. So at the highest level with the pei, you have pshat, which is the simple meaning. So it's the stories that are in the Torah. Okay, we read them, we understand them, and on the surface, they're interesting, sometimes very puzzling stories. And the rabbis of the Talmud say they've got to have a deeper meaning because we could have written better stories than this. So therefore, if God is writing this, they must have deeper meaning. And by the way, Paul would be right there. I'm sorry, the rabbis of the Talmud would be right there with Chabad, understanding that Torah is literally the word of God.
That's right.
Right. So then the Resh in Pardes stands for remes, which means hint or an allegorical meaning. So passing through the sea is reminiscent of birth, right? It's passing through a birth canal. And in fact, the word Mitzrayim, which means our word in Hebrew for Egypt, which is Mitzrayim, means narrow places. So we're leaving narrow places, going through a canal, if you will, with lots of water. This should remind those of you with some understanding of biology of birth.
Yeah,
So that's
right.
an allegorical meaning of the
Exactly.
the passing through the sea. Then there's drash, and we talk about midrash, and Erwin is always helping us with midrash here. And so one of my favorite little bits of midrash is when God cries out to Cain, "Where's your brother?" And Cain responds very famously, "I don't know, am I my brother's keeper?" God says, "Your brother's blood cries out to me." And but the text, there's either a typo or a deliberate word. The word blood in that text is plural. Your brother's bloods cry out to me. And so the question is, why is it plural? Might be a typo. Who knows? Well, that's one explanation. But the rabbis of the Talmud say the blood that is crying out to God is not only the blood of Abel, but all the descendants that will never be born from Abel. So they come up with the teaching that if you murder one person, you murder an entire world.
Right.
And if you save a life, you save an entire world.
Right.
So they get that from a yud. They get that from one letter in the text, which makes the word blood plural. That's drash.
Wow.
And then sod. Sod is secret. So there are secret meanings in the text. And one that we have discussed, and I think I have an illustration of this, is the shape of the letter bet, is teaching us we can only go in one direction, the direction of Torah. We can't ask what happened before Torah. We can't ask what happens above Torah. We can't ask what happens below Torah. And I'll just conclude with an insight from a wonderful biblical commentator, Aviva Zornberg, which is pshat. The simple story is what you tell your therapist, and drash is what your therapist hears. I just like that. Alan,
is this last level, the fourth one, Assad, is that connected? Is Assad the way in which Kabbalah as a level is more something different than that?
Yeah. So what I would say is, the Zohar, which is the central text of Kabbalah. And by the way, I think my next class for Monday nights is going to be on Kabbalah and going through some of my Kabbalah teachings really slowly and carefully like this. So the Zohar is structured as a commentary on Torah. And so what I would say is, I don't know if it's generally true of all of Kabbalah, but what Kabbalah is doing is exploring deeper and deeper meanings of Torah, including, I would say, secret meanings of Torah.
Yeah.
I think I may have an example of that. So a sort of example of that. Okay. So as I was saying, I love to read Torah.
Can I just ask a question? I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
I didn't react yet. I didn't. Does that mean that everybody that lived around that time near Mount Sinai had the ability to use analogies like that? I don't know if all the people were that clever or not. I mean, who taught them?
No.
Well,
let me answer your question directly. It doesn't say anything about that. What it says is that we have a text.
Right.
And that text is infinitely deep in meaning and has powerful meaning on at least 4 levels. Whether the people standing around listening to it, because the tradition is they only heard the first 2 commandments, but whether the people at that time understood all those levels of depth, I don't know any thought in Judaism which suggests that. But what Judaism says is, this is the record of God's communicating with us, and it's infinitely deep in meaning, which is why we have such an interesting time at Torah study, because we're reading the same Torah that we've read, 40, 50 times, and we're still discovering new insights from it.
Yes. That I can see.
Okay, good. So as I was alluding, I love to read the Torah in at least 2 ways. One is traditionally through the eyes of the rabbis, the mystics, and so on. And this includes the traditional commentators, the authors of Midrash, Talmud, commentary. I love studying that stuff. But I also love reading Torah and Bible through what I would call scholarly perspectives, with the insights of historians and scholars who investigate how the text came to be. So this includes the documentary hypothesis. I hope you're familiar with that idea, and other biblical scholarship. So, for example, there is a J text and an E text in Torah. And the most obvious difference between them is that the J text refers to God as Yud He Vav He. The E text refers to God as Elohim. And the scholars believe that the J text was written in the southern tribes in Judah, and the E text was written in the northern tribes. And the northern tribes were subject to being conquered by Assyria and so on. So scholars would try and read it through those eyes and try and understand it more deeply through the eyes of the historical perspective. I love to read Torah in that way as well. And so here's a quote from Einstein talking about an analogous problem in physics. It seems as though we must use sometimes one theory and sometimes the other, while at times we may use either. We are faced with a new kind of difficulty. We have two contradictory pictures of reality. Separately, neither of them fully explain the phenomenon of light, but together they do. And this gets back to something I'm sure I talked about last time, which is should we understand light as being a wave or as a collection of particles? And the answer is, if I restrict my view of light to one of those two, I can't explain the way light behaves in the universe. But even though those theories are contradictory, I need them both to understand how light behaves. And I approach Torah and tradition the same way. So, was the universe created in 6 days or in 13 billion years, as we asked before? So, an allegorical approach is that the creation story teaches about the nature of God and the nature of humanity. The opening verse is a grammatical impossibility. You've probably heard me talk about this, teaching that we must interpret it. If I try and translate the opening phrase of the Bible literally, I can't. There's a grammatical error in between word 1 and word 2. And what Rashi and the rabbis say is God was teaching us, you can't just translate, you have to dig in and interpret. But a literal approach, so here's an example of how both can be literally true. 6 days equals 13.8 billion years. 6 days in God's inertial reference frame may be 13.8 billion years in the Earth's inertial reference frame, according to the theory of relativity's teaching about time dilation. So I don't know if you understand that, but I think even if how many people don't have a clue as to what that's about? Raise your hand, just so I can see.
Say it again, Rabbi.
Well, it's on the screen. That 6 days in God's inertial reference frame can be 13.8 billion years in our inertial reference frame, according to the theory of general relativity. So the time slows down with speed. And if you're really interested, I can explain it. I should have a slide to explain it. So, and we know this to be true. This is predicted by Einstein in general relativity, and we know it's true because we have to make that correction for the GPS satellites. And we know, I mean, here's a simple explanation of why it has to be true. Solar wind particles interact with the atmosphere above the Earth, right? We saw that, the Northern Lights. And certain interactions give rise to other particles which have very short half-lives. These particles may only exist like for a nanosecond, a billionth of a second, and then they decay into something else, okay?
Yeah.
Light travels about a meter in a nanosecond. So if that's true, those particles should never reach the Earth. But we detect them and see them much lower in the atmosphere. So time is going slower for those particles. My point is, you can actually take the position that, and there is a guy named Gerald Schroeder, who is a Chabad focused astrophysicist, who takes the position that the Torah's account of creation is literally true using these kinds of techniques. I have a quote from him and in a moment, but I think there were some questions. Yeah, Alan, go ahead.
So this concept that time slows down, which I understand is reflected in what you said about Einstein, and therefore I can understand it 100 years after him. But what happened? What was understood by the rabbis in the 2nd century CE?
We're going to say, they would say 6 days. They didn't have a concept of 13.8 billion years. So they would say Torah is literally true. So it's only when we start understanding physics that we have an apparent glaring contradiction. And one way of resolving that glaring contradiction is to say the Torah's account is allegorical. It's like the boy who cried wolf. Another way is to dig into the physics and say, no, it's literally true. And again, maybe after we finish, if people are really dying to get a better insight into that, I will explain. I should create a slide for that. So looking at the text both ways is like understanding that light is both a wave and a particle. Okay, we got a little more time. So this is from this guy Gerald Schroeder. So he's observing that the shape of the letter Bet teaches us that we can't ask what happened before creation. And he goes on to say the sequence of creation in Torah can correspond to what cosmology teaches. So I remember I've actually attended several lectures by him. So imagine we are sitting in the universe somewhere. This actually doesn't make sense from a physics point of view, but never mind. But we're sitting in the universe somewhere, and off there in the distance is the Big Bang. Everybody with me?
Yeah.
So the question is, what happens? Light is moving at the speed of light, but we're far away. So, and then the Big Bang initially, the primordial atom of the Big Bang, and in the early days, early seconds, I should say, early microseconds of the Big Bang, everything is a giant black hole. The gravitational force going on there is so strong that light can't escape. Okay? All of a sudden, we get to the point where the velocity of expansion and the size of the expansion is so great that the gravitational force of the Big Bang is no longer containing light. And in the words of Torah, Yehi Or, and there was light. So what Gerald Schroeder does is he goes through the whole thing and goes line by line almost, arguing that what we understand about modern cosmology can really be interpreted through Torah. And I'm going to have another example of that. Yeah, go ahead, Jay. You need to unmute. I muted you before when you were talking on the phone. You need to unmute, Jay. Jay, you're muted.
Does this change it?
Yep, this is it. Go ahead.
Okay. Shape of the letter Bet teaches that we can't ask what happened before creation.
Right.
Do something to that for me, please.
Explain it?
Yes.
Oh, sure. So look at the letter Bet. I think I have another slide on this, but look at the letter Bet. You see it?
Yes.
I think I can magnify slide. Okay. Oh. Okay, I'm going to do it again. Whoop, no. Maybe I can only do it once. I don't know. Okay. It is letter Bet.
Yeah.
In the Torah, all the rest of the Torah is over here, right? To the left of the letter Bet.
It is.
Well, it says, I mean, goes in that direction. We read Hebrew from right to left, right? Correct?
Well, yeah. Oh, but Bet is not like Aleph. Is that the Bet of Aleph Beis?
I can't remember if I have another slide on this. The first letter in the Torah is Bet. The opening of the Torah is Bereshit bara Elohim. So, one this I would say is sod, would say, if you look at this letter bet, I wish I could make it bigger. No, I can't. I bet I can do a whiteboard or something.
Yes, you can do that.
Well,
Depends
no,
on
I don't know how to do it.
if you do that, your mouse will just let you draw, I think.
Yeah, no. Whoops. Let me just quickly take a quick look at this. I know there's, I think I got to go to, yeah, I think I can do it like this. Hang on. I think I stopped sharing, right? So let me go here. Whoops. Share. I think it's probably under advanced. No, I don't know how to do it.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
an
So
easier-
so what? So yeah. Let me get back to the. Sorry about that. I could do a whiteboard. I don't remember how to do a whiteboard.
an easier question?
Yes. Go ahead.
We can't ask what happened before creation.
Right.
Well,
It's a meaningless question.
good answer.
Thank you. Yeah. So I talked about this in the Big Bang, time begins with the Big Bang. So now going to physics, asking what happened before the Big Bang is a meaningless question. And my best illustration of this, taught to me by my friend Bob Piccioni, is, Jay, if you're standing on the very North Pole, okay? Imagine you're standing on the North Pole, okay?
Okay.
Take a step to the east.
I'm assuming that would be to the left.
Oh, every direction when you're in the North Pole is south, correct?
I don't know, but if you say
Well,
so.
think about it. Think about it. If you're on the North Pole,
Yeah,
every
okay.
direction is south.
Okay.
So my asking you to take a step to the east is a meaningless question. That just illustrates the idea of a meaningless question.
So is this a meaningless question?
Well, what Schroeder is saying is that the letter, why does the Torah begin with the letter bet? One answer,
What happened to Aleph?
Aleph is the first letter of the alphabet, but the first word in the Torah is Bereshit.
Okay.
In the beginning, okay?
Thank you.
So why does the Torah begin with the letter bet? And there's a whole series of midrashes on this, with all the letters fighting with God, asking them for the honor to begin the Torah. But one answer is the letter bet is a closed box, open only on the left. Okay, you with me on that?
Yep.
Okay, which teaches all information is through the left, which is Torah, because that's the way Hebrew is read. That's just an illustration of a mystical interpretation.
Okay. Missed it.
Okay, I'm going to do one more. So this is from Gerald Schroeder's book. Nachmanides, 13th century commentator on the Bible, Spanish, and a mystic. Okay, this is the way Nachmanides describes creation. Okay, remember he is writing 700 years ago or so. At the briefest instant following creation, all the matter in the universe was concentrated in a very small place, no larger than a grain of mustard. That's the smallest thing that he could imagine. The matter at this time was so thin, so intangible that it didn't have real substance. It did have, however, the potential to gain substance and form and to become tangible matter. From the initial concentration of this intangible substance in its minute location, the substance expanded, expanding the universe as it did so. As the expansion progressed, a change in the substance occurred. This initially thin, non-corporeal substance took on the tangible aspects of matter as we know it. From this initial act of creation, everything that has existed or will ever exist was, is, and will be formed. So this is Nachmanides describing the moment of creation, which sounds a heck of a lot like the Big Bang. So this is in support, Paul, of the Chabad approach, to say the Torah really describes it accurately. But of course, this is through the eyes of Nachmanides, writing 2,300 years after Sinai. I think I'm going to probably pause here. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is a perfect place to pause. Okay. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to stop sharing. So I am tempted to give you what I think might be a simple explanation for time dilation. Okay. Are you ready?
Yeah, that's interesting. Please.
Okay. Take a deep breath. Here goes. The central, I would say it's an assumption by Einstein in special relativity is that light moves at a constant speed, irrespective of the speed you're going. Okay? And let me tell you what I mean by that. Let's say I'm in a train here, right? And I'm going forward, let's just say 500 miles an hour in the train. Everybody with me? And I have a gun which fires a bullet, and the speed of the bullet is 500 miles an hour. You with me?
Yeah.
So let's say the train is not moving yet. I fire the bullet. I measure the speed at 500 miles an hour with my little measuring device. And Henry is sitting at the train station, and he measures it optically. He measures it at 500 miles an hour. Everybody with me? I need a response.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now I'm going to start moving ahead at 500 miles an hour. Okay, so I'm in this bullet train, no pun intended, although it's actually a pretty good pun. I'm in a bullet train, right?
Yeah.
And inside the train, I'm going to shoot my same gun. And I'm going to measure the speed of that bullet. It's going to be 500 miles an hour sitting inside the train. Henry is sitting at the station. He's going to measure the speed of the bullet. I'm going to ask Henry, because you're an engineer, what would you measure the speed of the bullet to be?
500 miles an hour.
No, 1,000. Because I'm going 500 miles an hour.
Oh, that's right.
The bullet
That's right.
is in the train going 500 miles an hour inside the train.
Right, right.
And so you would just add it, okay?
Right. Yeah, you're right.
What Einstein says is, let's say instead of a bullet, it's a light wave.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm in a rocket, not just a good old-fashioned train.
Mm-hmm.
And I turn on my little flashlight, and I have a device to measure the speed of light.
Mm-hmm.
And I measure it at 186,000 miles a second. That's the speed of light. 3 times 10 to the 8th meters a second. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Now,
My rocket ship is going 99.9%, 0.9999. I'm going almost at the speed of light.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Henry is standing on a star measuring the speed of light inside my rocket ship.
Mm-hmm.
You would think it would be almost double.
Nope.
But I'm in one inertial reference frame, it's called. Henry's in another inertial reference frame. Einstein's conclusion, which doesn't make sense, is that we both measure the speed of light to be the same speed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, everybody take a deep breath.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. And there are experiments to prove that. And if you're interested, Google the Michelson-Morley experiment. Okay, that actually proved it. No, it didn't prove it. No, yeah, yes, it did prove it, actually. Okay. So now let's think about this for a second. I am going to invent a clock. Okay. The clock is a simple one, would be a bouncing ball. And the ball takes a certain amount of time to travel up and down, and that's my unit of time. Okay. Now, suppose if instead of a bouncing ball, I take a bouncing light wave, a bouncing light pulse.
Yeah.
And it goes from here down to there and back up again. Okay? Okay, that's my unit of time. Now, and this is the tricky part, I'm going to start moving. And Henry is sitting in his office watching this bouncing light pulse. For me, it looks like it's just going straight up and down because I'm moving, but Henry is going to see it go through a V, right? Right, Henry? Everybody else see that? So it's going to travel a longer distance from Henry's point of view than from my
Mhm.
point of view. I don't know if you're following me. Okay. So if it travels a longer distance, but it's moving at the same speed,
Mhm.
time has to slow down. As Henry monitors my clock, time has slowed down for me. That is time dilation. And it's true. We can measure it. And it actually explains phenomenon. And sure enough, when they shoot rockets into space and they're orbiting the Earth, for X amount of time at very high speeds, they can measure, a few thousandths or, millionths of a second different. So that is time dilation. And Gerald Schroeder said that's how God's inertial reference frame is so different from ours that 6 days can be 13.8 billion years. Your job is to write a 200-word essay, what I've written, and if you get it right, you can clean the erasers next week. Alan.
So it's reminding me, I don't understand what you said enough to write this essay, so don't wait for it. But the part that it's reminding me has to do with sound, not the bullet itself, the Doppler effect, right?
But it applies to sound,
It does.
but it
Okay.
doesn't apply to light. Oh, actually, I shouldn't say that. Doppler effect applies to light. The Doppler effect doesn't have an effect on speed. It has an effect on frequency.
I was trying to connect the sound at Sinai that everybody heard.
Yeah. It's a good idea, but it's not what I'm talking about.
Okay, thanks.
So, for example, the Doppler effect is a train is coming. It's, when it's coming toward you, the sound waves are compressed. When it's going away from you, the sound waves are expanded. That's the Doppler effect. We
Yeah.
see that in light, and we can measure this. We can measure the speed of stars moving away from us by the shift in the frequency coming from the stars. And that's called the Doppler shift, redshift.
I didn't know that was in light also, or didn't.
Yeah. One smart Aleck said that he got a ticket for going through a red light, and he was a physicist and a smart ass. I think the technical term is. So he went before the judge, and he said, "Well, because I was going toward the light, there was a compression there was a Doppler effect, and what might have actually been a red light was compressed to the point that it was a green light." Okay. And the judge, who was even a smarter smart ass, said, "Well, that would mean you were going an appreciable fraction of the speed of light. So you tell me how you want me to write this judgment based on, going through a red light or speeding, in a 45 mile an hour zone at 186,000 miles a second."
I tried to find a ticket with the yellow light that I said I could see, still see it in my mirror. And of course, that didn't go very well because it's never yellow that long.
Yep. So anyway, now you've gotten through physics, and next time, you're going to see an example of artificial intelligence creating a picture for me, which is
No
really
way.
fun.
That's no way. No way.
You got some AI here, huh?
Yeah, you're going to see it. You're going to wait.
All right.
I'm going to make you wait to see it. So thank you all. Any other questions, comments? Go ahead.
Next week is in the
Very good. Thanks.
Okay.
Next week is the intermediate days of Passover. We're still having our class.
Yeah, I'm.
right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, if I wanted to be, that won't affect me, and I don't think there's even any halachic objection. I mean, if it was on a Seder night, there would be a halachic objection, but there isn't. So there's no reason to cancel it.
Thank you.
Oh,
Okay.
Thank you.
You
Very
are
good
welcome.
class.
So we've
Gary's
gotten into
going so
relativity,
much. Thank
we've
you.
gotten into Nachmanides.
Mary told me she's going to go back to school and study to be a physicist, didn't you?
Who is?
Jerry. She said.
Oh yeah. I've inspired her.
All right. Get another degree.
Fly. When pigs fly, right.
Okay. Well, pigs can fly, and it's okay as long as you don't eat them.
Right.
Okay. Good night, all. See you next time.
All right.
my God.
Thank you.